Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to peel back the layers of the global financial system to solve a completely mind-bending mystery about world debt. It's one of those concepts that sounds literally impossible when you say it out loud. Every country is broke, every country is in massive debt, but somehow everybody is still getting paid. Well, today, we're going to figure out exactly how this machine works. Okay, let's just jump right into the massive number at the center of it all. $320 trillion. That is the current total of global debt. And to put that absolutely astronomical figure into perspective, that's 3 times more than all the actual money that physically exists in the entire world. Which brings us to the ultimate paradox of our global economy. It's a question that honestly breaks all conventional logic. If there is 3 times more debt than money out there, and literally everyone on the planet owes someone else, well, who exactly is left holding the bag? Who's the one getting paid? To figure that out, we really need to go back to the beginning. Section 1. A brief history of debts. To understand our modern debt trap, we have to recognize that borrowing now and worrying about it later is actually an ancient trick. It goes all the way back 5,000 years to Mesopotamia, starting with simple promises to repay loans of grain. And as these debts inevitably crush societies, kings historically took some pretty drastic measures. Like back in 1307, Francis Philip IV literally just arrested his creditors, the Knights Templar, so he could erase his debt. Problem solved, right? Then in the 1340s, England's Edward III just straight up refused to pay his loans, which ended up crashing Europe's entire financial system. Fast forward to 1694, and the Bank of England completely changes the game by inventing patriotic government bonds. But honestly, the biggest shift of all, that happened in 1971. See, for decades, the US dollar was kept heavily disciplined because it was strictly backed by physical gold locked away in vaults. But by 1971, America had spent a massive amount on wars and welfare. So other countries, France specifically, started demanding their physical gold back. They were literally sending warships to New York to collect it. To put a stop to this, President Nixon took action and completely severed the gold standard. He basically gave birth to modern fiat currency, which is money that holds value purely because the government says so. And the direct fallout of that specific moment, the Nixon shock, was just an absolute explosion in borrowing. Without the strict limits of physical gold holding things back, global debt skyrocketed over the next 50 years. I mean, we went from a few $1 trillion in 1971 to $320 trillion today. That is a staggering 31,400% increase. So, who holds all of this? Section 2, the infinite financial loop. So who actually holds the bag for the world's absolute largest debtor, the United States? The answer isn't some shadowy elite or a foreign power. Surprisingly enough, the vast majority of the U.S.'s $36 trillion debt, we're talking 70% of it, is entirely domestic. It's owed to Americans themselves. Let me break down exactly how this trap works with your own money. Watch how this builds into this crazy circular loop. Step 1, you deposit $1,000 into your local bank. Step 2, your bank immediately turns around and lends that to the government by buying treasury bonds. Step 3, the government takes your money and spends it on roads or the military. Step 4, the government pays your bank the interest on those bonds using your own tax dollars. And then finally, step 5, your bank hands you back a tiny slice of that as your savings return. It's essentially a financial snake eating its own tail. You're literally paying yourself with your own tax money. But it actually gets even more circular when you look at the federal level. The government literally owes trillions to its own programs. The single largest chunk of this is over $2.7 trillion, and it's owed to the Social Security Trust Fund. Think about that. That means your future retirement checks are quite literally backed by government IOIs made out to itself. This debt is everywhere. It's in your pension, your bank, your insurance. Now, you might be wondering about the 30% that's held overseas. And yes, Japan owns $1.1 trillion of U.S. debt, and China owns $816 billion. But on the flip side, America actually owns $7.86 trillion in debt from other countries. Japan owns Chinese debt, China owns Japanese debt. Internationally, it's just this massive game of financial musical chairs. The debt never disappears. Everybody just owes everybody else.
Section 3, when the machine breaks.
So the whole system only really works because the money just keeps circulating. But what happens if a country simply decides they've had enough, stops playing the game, and halts all the borrowing? Well, this is what happens. Back in 2010, investors panicked and suddenly stopped buying Greek bonds. The money tap just shut off entirely. The austerity that followed was brutal. 1 in 4 public workers were fired, wages plummeted by 30%, and the country's economy shrank by a quarter. 200,000 young Greeks just packed up and left the country. You literally had college graduates working as waiters in Berlin. And you want to know the cruelest twist? Their total debt still went up because a collapsed economy obviously collects way less in taxes. You really cannot just hit the brakes on the machine without sacrificing an entire generation. And governments around the world absolutely learned that lesson. To avoid falling into that Greek nightmare during the 2020 COVID shutdowns, the U.S. government was forced to borrow a staggering $3.8 trillion in a single year. That was nearly 20% of its entire economy. They did it just to keep people afloat and prevent a total economic collapse when global spending just froze overnight. But here's the catch. Borrowing to survive carries a massive cost, and that's interest. The main trap of this survival strategy is that older loans require massive interest payments. Right now, the U.S. writes a check for over $1 trillion a year just to pay the interest on its old loans. That's $1 trillion not going to schools or hospitals. It's actually more than the entire defense budget, and it's just going straight to the banks. And to afford those payments, governments are essentially forced to constantly borrow even more money. Now, a really common question here is why not just print the money and cheat the math? Well, you can look at the historical consequences for that answer. Venezuela tried it and they hit 9,586% inflation. A morning coffee that cost 2,300 bolivars would cost 6,000 by the very same afternoon. Zimbabwe hit a completely unimaginable 79.6 billion% monthly inflation and literally had to abandon its currency entirely. If you just fire up the money printer instead of borrowing, you end up having to carry literal wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. There really is no easy escape hatch. Section 4. The modern debt trap. So, while richer nations can usually find a way to outgrow their loans, developing nations are finding themselves completely caught in a modern survival crisis. Through China's Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing has lent out roughly $1 trillion to 150 different countries to build out things like ports, railways, and highways. And while that might sound generous up front, it has resulted in absolutely massive debt-to-GDP ratios. For example, Djibouti owes China a staggering 77% of its total GDP. Montenegro borrowed an amount equal to 25% of its GDP just to build a single highway. These are just crushing numbers for nations that are just trying to build basic infrastructure. And when these countries inevitably struggle to pay back those foreign banks, the consequences are incredibly severe. It perfectly illustrates the mechanics of what a lot of people call debt imperialism. Back in 2017, Sri Lanka couldn't repay its loans for the Hambantota port project, so China didn't just forgive the debt. Instead, they took a 99-year lease on the port and 15,000 acres of the surrounding land. When you default on these loans, actual sovereignty and hard, physical assets change hands. Section 5. The ultimate currency is trust. Okay, so we've seen the unbelievable scale of this burden, the deep history, the completely closed loops, and the devastating consequences of default. So let's finally solve the core mystery of this explainer, the idea that nobody gets paid and everybody gets paid. The whole system really only functions because we all collectively agree to keep playing. The global debt never actually leaves the system. It simply changes hands in one massive continuous loop. And the thing is, that loop is spinning faster than ever before. Right now, global debt is constantly expanding at a frankly astonishing rate, $100,000 every single second. This entire velocity, the whole engine, is completely reliant on one singular thing: everyone believing that everyone else will eventually pay. It runs purely 100% on trust. But behind the scenes, some players are definitely getting nervous. Recognizing that this entire $320 trillion system is basically built on fragile and visible faith, several major nations, we're talking China, Russia, India, and Turkey, are quietly starting to stockpile physical gold. They are literally hoarding hard, physical assets, basically prepping for the day the music finally stops. Because when you get right down to it, the world's debt isn't held by some shadowy villains sitting in a hidden room. It's your pension, it's your savings account, it's your insurance policy. The system owes you, you owe the system, and our mutual collective trust is quite literally the only thing keeping the global economy afloat. Which leaves us with one final kind of terrifying thought to take away. If the entire system runs strictly on trust, and everyone is busy borrowing from everyone else, what happens the day we actually stop trusting each other?